project to TS. I don't know if it'll do anything to the already running stream. Probably not. Let's see if I already see it in. Yeah, it's welcome to our live show. It's the same old bullshit. I just want to publish the thing on X and on Blue Sky. So just a second. So let me just post it on both. Just 1 second. Okay, from my perspective, we can start.
Okay, I think we're already live, so
Yeah, we are.
people are getting the benefits of this pre-recording
Yeah,
conversation.
amazing benefits. Uh, you can like or retweet me, by the way. Just not that
I
it does
can? Oh, I am honored.
not that it does that much of a difference, but you know.
I always forget what your Twitter account is.
Dan
Oh, here it
Shapir.
is. I got it. Here we go. There. It just showed up right in my feed. There you go.
Surprisingly, Dan Shapir.
Yeah, I never know. All right, so you're gonna kick us off? You want me to
No,
do my
you
shtick?
should kick us off. You'll be the
Okay,
host.
I'll do my shtick. All right, 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another thrilling episode. I was going to say example episode of JavaScript Jabber. I am Steve Edwards, the host with the face for radio and the voice for being a mime, but Dan voted me the host, so you're stuck with me. Speaking of panelists, was I speaking of panelists? Now I am. Anyway, Dan Shapiro is here with me. We are flying solo today. How you doing, Dan?
I'm doing great.
So let's do our usual weather report. It is cool and rainy here in Portland. Shocking for Oregon in April, I know. How's things in
Uh,
Tel Aviv?
guess.
Warm and sunny.
How did you ever guess?
Oh, I don't know.
We literally didn't really have a winter this year, to be honest. It was
Oh,
more like a bit of a fall. Not that, you know, we should have more rain than we did, but, it's still lovely weather, at least that. And it still is lovely weather.
fabulous. Well, it's fabulous for you. It's jealous for me. But anyway, so today we are going to be talking about a practical application of TypeScript in JavaScript. I'll let Dan give the details, but we're going to talk about everything that was involved in. Was it a new project? I already forgot.
No, so, yeah.
I'll let
So,
you talk from here so I don't mess it up anymore.
all good. So basically, I had this interesting situation at work. We have a large legacy JavaScript project that's still a core part of our offering, and it's under active, well, beyond maintenance. It's being actively developed and enhanced and improved and whatnot. But it's all done in JavaScript. It's 100% JavaScript because it was started more than 8 years ago, and it was never moved over to TypeScript. It just stayed JavaScript. And I was looking at introducing TypeScript into that project. Actually, that project has two parts. It has a server that's just running on Node.js with Express, and it has a client or front end side, which is implemented in React. Um, that part actually, again, talking legacy, some years ago, before I joined the company, they made the kind of unfortunate choice to introduce Flow into the front end part for type safety, and they only did it partially. I didn't want to touch Flow yet, so I was looking at introducing TypeScript to the backend part, to the Node.js part of the project. And it turned out that it was much more complicated and error prone than I expected. There were a lot of pitfalls and gotchas along the way. I kind of thought that, given that the whole idea of TypeScript is to get JavaScript devs onto the bandwagon, that it should be really easy and straightforward, and it wasn't. And I even consulted with some TypeScript luminaries like Matt Pocock, had a lot of great advice and suggestions, but it still wasn't easy. Also with Jack Harrington and others. They all had great advice, but it still was much more challenging than I expected. And the end result is that I kind of documented the entire process, did something like an internal blog about it, and we have this internal wiki. So I wrote a whole document about how to do it so that if and when we do it in another project, it'll be much easier that time around. And I thought that it would be interesting and useful for our audience for me to share this information. I hope that it is.
Okay, so just to clarify, we're on the front end, you're still sticking with what was there, right? In other words, you're going to go with the flow, shall we say? And then on the
Uh,
back end was where you're doing your TypeScript upgrading.
yeah, so the answer is actually that our ultimate intention is to do TypeScript on both sides. But I wanted to start somewhere, and it seemed easier to start with the just JavaScript part because Flow and TypeScript, while they are similar, they're not the same, they're not compatible, and I didn't want to get into the whole mess of how I get TypeScript and Flow working together in the same project.
Oh,
Um,
you wouldn't replace Flow with TypeScript?
I would, but these are large projects. So replacing, well, let's put it this way. I really wanted to do everything gradually. It's important to emphasize this point. So, for example, talking about the just to give an understanding of the size, the scope of the project. So, talking just about the backend part, that Node.js project, we're talking about close to 1,000 files, JavaScript files, about 70,000 lines of code, something like 3,500 commits since the project started over close to 8 years ago. So it's not a small project. And obviously, I can't move all the JavaScript files over to TypeScript, all 1,000 of them in one go. Now, there are some automated tools that automatically move all your JS files into TS and add types as best they can using all sorts of tricks and static analysis and whatnot. I did not want to do that. I was looking, the way that I wanted to go about it, and especially after I spoke with some people, is to enable a gradual migration. And I'll talk about the two ways in which a gradual migration can be achieved. By the way, if you want to understand why I'm looking at a gradual migration, why I prefer this approach, you can also listen to the interview that I did with Matt Pocock a while back about TypeScript, and we also discussed this aspect about migrating projects, although again, we did not go into the exact details that I'm intending to go into today. So the idea was to basically introduce TypeScript into the project so that we can do the actual migration of the files slowly over time. It could literally take years. Is that, is that clear? I hope.
Yes. Sorry, I was looking up the Matt Pocock episode so I could tell people what it was.
Yeah, we can probably put a link in the
538.
show notes. Yeah,
JavaScript Jabber 538.
yeah, it was an
Oh,
excellent episode. Highly recommended. Wait a minute. We did two episodes with him. Are you looking at the latest one, the one from like about a few months ago, or an older one from like 2 years ago?
yeah, 538 was probably a couple of years ago.
No, so we
So,
we did a more recent one.
okay, we'll find those and mention them later.
Okay. So again, we're talking about a 100% JavaScript project built on top of Node.js with Express. Like AJ likes it, it uses CommonJS rather than import, so it's a legacy project. For an API with the front end side, it actually uses a combination of Swagger and OpenAPI for public RESTful APIs, and actually GraphQL with Apollo for the internal private APIs. For unit testing, we used Mocha and Chai, and it has end-to-end tests implemented mostly using Playwright, but that's less relevant. As I said, almost 1,000 JavaScript files, almost 70,000 lines of code, and around 3,500 commits since the project started. And again, we use Squash, so it's really 3,500 PRs, really, rather than, along the way, there were a lot more commits, but they were just squashed together.
By squash, you mean not the vegetable, but when you do the Git merging in, you squash multiple commits into one bigger commit, right?
Exactly,
Just to
exactly.
clarify for
Yeah.
people.
Because there are a lot of small commits along the way. I'm fixing this, I'm fixing
Right.
that. They're not that interesting in most cases. You can keep them if they're really important, but in most cases they're not that interesting. Okay, so I was looking to enable a gradual migration, which means introducing TypeScript into the project, but not actually moving the entire project over to TypeScript. Maybe a few words about why I wanted to do that. Um, it's really funny. I also spoke about this with Matt. When TypeScript first was introduced, I had a kind of a negative attitude. When I came to JavaScript from statically typed languages like C++ and like Java, like C Sharp, and JavaScript, the dynamic nature of JavaScript afforded an amazing amount of freedom, and I loved it. But as I became ever more seasoned in JavaScript development, especially working in larger teams, I came to realize and understand that for larger projects involving larger teams, for production grade software, you want something that's more structured and rigid. You want something that helps you avoid certain errors that can easily happen if you're just using JavaScript. The obvious example is you just misspell or mistype a property name, and you just get undefined instead of the actual value, but there's no error in any other in any other way, and it seems to run, it just runs wrong. And that's one of those things that TypeScript protects you from. TypeScript also, the code is much more self-documented, especially if you're talking about APIs. If especially again, if you're talking about larger teams that compose software from parts, components, or services together, you want APIs that are much better structured and self-documented, and the integration with modern development tools like VS Code, especially, that does the much smarter autocomplete for you and puts squigglies if you pass in wrong parameter types or the wrong number of parameters or whatever. All these are super useful tools when you're working, especially as I said, in an enterprise type environment. And these days, it's also better with AI because it gives the AI greater context. By the way, all that being said, if I need to solve a lit code type problem, I'll probably just do it in JavaScript and not mess about with the types. But for everything else, I find that even though we are writing those types that ultimately are evaporated out of the code, because when TypeScript is compiled to JavaScript, it basically just strips out all the types. Despite that fact, I still find it incredibly useful for for the development and maintenance of larger, certainly of larger code bases. And especially in this case, the fact that the project was done in JavaScript and not TypeScript was definitely hurting our developer experience. Uh, just recently, somebody literally introduced a bug that could not have happened had the project been entirely done in TypeScript, and it didn't propagate all the way to production, but it was only caught by an end-to-end test, later down the line, and it was much more difficult and expensive to handle than if VS Code would just have put a squiggly under that offending instruction. So far, so good.
So far, so good.
By the way, I totally appreciate the fact that a lot of uh, front end developers or full stack developers still prefer to work in JavaScript. You do you, whatever works best for you. For me, after all these years, I've come to the conclusion that, again, for the larger projects involving multiple developers, certainly, I prefer you working in TypeScript. Okay, so I have the project. It's pulled down to my computer and I want to start. The first thing that I went about, again, because it's a legacy project, is I want to upgrade to make sure that Node is upgraded to the latest possible version, ideally to the latest LTE version, LTSS version, sorry, long term support version. And if people are curious about what that means, we had that conversation with the Node guys about the 9 pillars of Node. Uh, Hopefully, you're using something like NVM, the Node version management. So you just, you know, find the latest version you can support, ideally the latest LTS version, and put it in your NVMRC file. Update to that, and make sure that it runs and that you can work with it. Also, make sure that obviously that you were pulled on the latest version from, GitHub or whatever, and that it appears to work properly in your environment. The next step is to make sure, it seems obvious, I'll explain why it isn't, that your unit tests work correctly. Now, you might say, well, obviously, because otherwise the project will be broken. But in our case, at least, it turned out that some of the unit tests had cross dependencies. What that means is that they used mocks, but didn't always properly clean the mocks up. And as a result, some of the tests actually only passed when they were run in a particular order.
Oh, yeah, I've run
And
into that before. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and it turns out that it's everything seemed to be fine because when it was run in the JavaScript project, it happened to run in the correct order. Otherwise, people would have noticed and fixed it a while ago. But when I actually started moving the project over to TypeScript, it turned out that because of the transpilation step, things didn't run in exactly the same order, and then certain tests broke. Or I had certain situations where I needed to touch the business logic and then I wanted to run particular tests individually. And I found out that when I tried to run the tests individually, they failed. And then I went back to the original code and found that those tests, even when I ran them individually in the actual original JavaScript project, they also failed because they only passed when they will run in a batch in the appropriate order because, again, of mock leaks. I won't go into the detail of what mock leaks are. Basically, it just means that a mock was put in but wasn't properly removed at the end of the test, it consequently leaked into the next test, and it impacted that. And in that case, it actually enabled it to complete successfully. And when you just run that test on its own, it doesn't get those marks, and then it failed. So in
I
our
mean,
case,
the idea, I mean, obviously, I think the idea there is that tests should be self, what is it? They stand by themselves. Or, I don't know what the correct term is, right? So you're not dependent upon other tests.
yeah,
You
for
know,
sure.
tests should spin up your environment and give you a mock up and give you everything you need, run the test, break it down on the next test.
Yeah. By the way, even the fact that, a lot of the code has that so many marks were used were a testament to the fact that it was legacy code. Because ideally, in more modern code, I would use dependency injection and try to avoid so many marks. But again, the code is what it is, and that was the situation. So basically, the thing was that before I could actually start the migration to TypeScript, I actually needed to fix a bunch of mock leaks and get the tests to run properly in the original project before I even start migrating it over to TypeScript. So I verified that all the tests could run individually, and only then did I actually start the migration process. The next step, of course, is to install TypeScript and initialize it. So you do you n unless you're using npm or yarn or whatever, you npm or yarn add or npm install TypeScript. You do TypeScript init, and already here I ran into an issue because my default assumption was that the installation of TypeScript should be as a dev dependency, because why would you need the actual TypeScript compiler in the production environment? It's just part of your development pipeline in order to actually build the system, the installable part of your project. You only actually deploy the dist folder or whatever it is that you're creating. And it turns out that, at least in our case, and maybe also in the case of our listeners, that was not the case. I actually had to install it as a prod dependency. Are you familiar with the difference between a prod and a dev dependency?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we run into the same thing in the PHP world on the back end with Composer, where a similar analog to what you're doing is PHP Stan, which is a static analysis tool for PHP, where you don't want that, you know, in your uh, in your prod build. So you put it as a dev dependency. Use a save dev file.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I actually had to install TypeScript as a prod dependency in our case. And the reason was that the way that the build pipeline worked is that it actually created a pod for deployment, like a Docker pod, basically. And it actually did sort like a git pull inside the pod, and then ran the build in the pod. So if and it only ran the prod installation. So if I didn't put it as part of prod, I actually broke our CI/CD pipeline because it tried to run the TSC as part of the prod build, and it wasn't there. Now, ideally, I should fix the CI/CD pipeline so that it doesn't work this way. Maybe build it into a special environment and then copy the files over into the prod environment rather than build in the prod environment. But I wanted to reduce the amount of DevOps work that I actually had to do, and it seemed just a lot easier to just make TypeScript itself a prod dependency. It's less than ideal, of course, because you're shipping TypeScript as part of your node modules prod installation. But you know what? It's so big anyway. It didn't make that much of a difference in our case. And as I said, I just wanted to get over this blocker. So
So
again, this
just to
is some.
clear, so just to clarify that, so it doesn't, I'm not a big TypeScript user myself. Used it some, and not a real big user of it. But correct me if I'm wrong. But doesn't the whole point of the TypeScript compiler that as you write your TypeScript code and then it compiles it, does all its checking, it saves it to JavaScript files, and that's what you'd want to build off of? Am I correct?
Yeah, look, there are really two ways these days in which you can run um, TypeScript on top of Node. The way that you usually want to do in production environments is you want to run the TypeScript compiler, TSC. It runs, it does all the checks, it fails if it identifies an error, but if everything is fine, like you said, it generates JavaScript files from the TypeScript files. So for every .ts file, you get a .js file. And in that JS, it's basically just essentially look mostly like stripped out the type information. And then ideally, you would just deploy those JS files and you don't deploy the TS files. But as I explained, the way that our CI CD pipeline was built, uh, because it was originally done before TSC, nobody thought about that. The way that it worked was that it actually did a Git pull directly to the production pod that it was building, and then ran a quote unquote build on it, which effectively did very little in the pre TSC scenario. In the TSC scenario, that build actually runs the TSC compiler. So building the production um, pod required having TSC on that pod.
Mhm.
So again,
Okay.
not ideal. A better solution would be to fix the CI/CD pipeline, but that's how it was built when it was built, and I didn't want to mess about with the CI/CD job and build a new one or whatever. As I said, I don't consider myself a DevOps person, and if I can avoid doing that, then I prefer to. By the way, these days there's a different way for running TypeScript on top of Node. Um, Actually, there's a couple of ways. So first of all, there's this project called TS Node, which literally wraps Node and adds TSC support for TypeScript files into Node by effectively running TSC when it loads a file, when files are loaded into Node. So you can use TS Node to run the TypeScript files directly on Node without having to use TSC first to build the JavaScript project out of it. But obviously, this is not something you really want in production environments because all that thing adds a lot of overhead when the node process starts, and why pay for that overhead? Um, what the node team has recently done is they've actually added a new command line switch, which kind of quote unquote gives Node TS support. The way that they do it though is not by running TSC, is by stripping out the type information. So think about like it's overwriting all the type definition with spaces. So it's kind of evaporating the type information out of the TS files. And then what you're left with is just JavaScript, and it runs that. And it can do that fairly quickly. But conversely, it doesn't actually do any type checking. It just they expect you to do the type checking beforehand, but they say you can still run the TS files directly, and you hardly pay any overhead costs for that. Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
Good. But again, this is relatively new, relatively recent, and when I worked on that project, I didn't use it. So I really needed to compile the TS files into JS files. So as I said, I installed TS, I initialized it, but I put it as part of the prod dependency, not a dev dependency because of the way in which our CI/CD pipeline is built. When you install and initialize, when you initialize TypeScript, actually, it generates a tsconfig file or tsconfig.json file, to be precise, at the root of your folder, of your project, sorry. In fact, that's how TSC knows where the root of your project is. It assumes that where that file is located is the root of your project. And that tsconfig.json file is a JSON file, obviously, of configuration data for TSC, telling it how to work, how to process your project. For example, you can tell it which folders to include or exclude from its compilation. In our case, all the source files, except for the root index file, resided in an SRC folder, and all the test files, the unit test files, and also some of the end-to-end test files resided in a test folder. uh, I configured tsconfig to compile both these, to look at just these two folders. And by default, TSC tries to compile the files to be next to the original file. So if you have, let's say, an x.ts, it will generate an x.js alongside it. That is not what I wanted. The reason that this is not what I wanted is that my project is full of JS files. And I want them to be processed as well. And I can't generate an x.js file from an x.js file into the same folder. I have to generate it somewhere else. So I had to configure TSC to build everything into a dist folder. So it would take everything from the SRC and test folder and build them into a dist slash SRC and a dist slash test. Yeah,
So I
slosh.
don't know if I'm jumping ahead here, so pardon if I am, but is it normal practice to have like a TS file for the TypeScript and that compiles to JS, or is that
Yeah,
something you're
but
not really
like
going to do?
yeah, but like I said, I have 1,000 JS files, and I don't want to just arbitrarily rename all these files to .ts. So for the way that I want it to work is to manually transform each and every file at a time and do it
Okay.
gradually over time. So this project going all the way, if we ever go full TS, it might take years, and but we'll, every day or two we'll take a JS file and move it, that particular file, over to TS. But until we do, that file stays as JS. So I really need to have the TSC compiler take all the TS files, but also all the JS files. Effectively, I needed to quote unquote compile the JS files as well as the TS files because I need them all to be compiled into the same folder, because otherwise I'll break the project structure. I can't just compile the TS files. If I have 1,000 files in this project that are JS and 3 files that I've moved over to TS, I need the resulting disk folder to have all the JS files, both from the originals and from the ones that I've already moved. I hope I'm explaining it clearly enough.
Yeah, I get it.
The other thing I enabled incremental build for speed. Incremental build means that the TSC maintains something like a cache, and it sees that, hey, this file that I previously compiled, nothing has changed in it based, let's say, on the time and date, so I don't need to compile it again. And this way, you don't need to compile the entire project each and every time, even though in our case it was very, very quick. precisely because most of the files, it was just taking JS files and generating JS files from them almost as is, which apparently it can do very quickly. Um, I specified the latest possible target base in terms of the JavaScript support based on the Node.js version that we're using. And since, as I said, the project is using CommonJS, which means it uses require rather than import, and also all the tests that we had did a lot of their mocking based on the assumption that require was being used. I configured the output to be CommonJS. That means that in the TS files that we're creating, we can actually start using imports. But when the TSC compiles it into JavaScript, those import become requires. Now, again, this is less than ideal because ideally we would like to also move eventually from CommonJS over to ESM. But one thing at a time. You can't do everything all at once. Um, so the next thing that I did was allow JS files, since, as I explained multiple times, we aren't actually converting most of the files yet. Most of the files remain JS. What it means by allow JS files, it means that the TSC will also process the JS files, effectively copying them over into the dist folder when it compiles the project.
So
Um,
did that you had to do that because you mentioned that earlier about creating that
because
separate disk folder?
if I don't do that, think what would happen. That this folder will only contain
Right.
the like
Okay.
the three JS files that were compiled out of the TS. So sorry, I wouldn't be able to run the original because the original already contains some TS files,
Hmm.
and Node doesn't know how to run them, at least not without that special command line switch.
Hmm.
The dist folder would just contain the JS files generated from those TS files, so most of the files will be gone. So neither the original source nor the dist folder would be runnable.
Right.
I wanted the dist folder to be runnable, which means that all the JS files needed to be compiled, quote unquote, into that folder as well.
So my point was just that you had to have this in conjunction with the earlier build step that copies everything to the separate dist folder, or you'd get a whole lot of nothing.
Basically, yes.
Okay.
Now, some of the JS files actually required JSON files that were also located in the SRC folder with them. So what you also need to enable is the flag that tells TSC to uh, to resolve JSON files. So it sees that a certain JavaScript or TypeScript files requires a JSON file. It will also copy that JSON file over to that dist folder in the same relative location. And because if I initially neglected to do that, it didn't find those JSON files when I tried to run the project, and that turned out to be bad. You can easily search your folder and see if you've got any files that don't match the .js or .jsx extension, and then you know that you need to make sure that these are copied over into the dist folder as well, and preferably by the TSC compiler itself. The next thing that I needed to do was enable source maps for debugging. Since I still want to be able to debug the project, but now I'm actually running it from the dist folder, but I want to debug it in the TypeScript files. I want to see the original code that I wrote when I put in breakpoints, not the compiled output code. It's very similar, but it's not identical, and I prefer debugging the original. So in order to achieve that, you enable source maps. Source maps are maps with a .map extension that are generated by default in the same dist folder alongside the JS files. So if you had an x.ts, it gets compiled into the same relative location in the dist folder into actually two files, one with a .x.js and one with called x.map. And actually at the very bottom of the JS file, it adds a special comment that tells DevTools where that where the map file is located. And in this case, it's easy because it's located in exactly the same place. So it's a simple relative location. Map files enable debuggers like DevTools, which is built into Chrome or Edge, or effectively any DevTools of any debugger, any browser, sorry, or the built-in debuggers in most IDEs, to be able to single step through the original files, because the the debugger is smart enough to understand that this line in this file is actually translated, it matches that line in the original file, and here's the location of that original file relative to the compiled output file. The next thing I enabled was strict type checking. I was kind of concerned about that, but there was no problem with it, so I used that. And I also, in our case, because we're using CommonJS, I made sure to enable the flag that instructs TSC to always put ustrict at at the top of the generated files. If you're using ESM, you don't need it, because ESM module files are strict by default. But in our case, since everything was compiled to CommonJS, I really wanted to have use strict there to get strict behavior.
So can
JavaScript
you
strict behavior.
elucidate on what strict means or what it's going to do
Yeah,
for you?
strict is a very old JavaScript feature. It dates back to ES6 or before. Basically, so there was certain, let's call it less than ideal behaviors in JavaScript that they unfortunately could not remove out of the language due to backward compatibility issues. And the way that they decided to fix them was add this use strict directive that if you put it at the top of your file, for example, it's just a string, quote, open quote, use strict, close quote. It puts the JavaScript engine in strict mode, which changes those certain bad behaviors. A couple of examples: um, the with statement turned out to be a bad idea in JavaScript for various reasons. With ustrict, with is gone. There's also a difference in what happens if you try to use this outside the context of an object. You know, if you just have a function and it does this dot x, before use strict, it would default to the global object. With strict, it defaults to undefined. So they made certain changes that improved the behavior of JavaScript, but they were not backward compatible. So they had to add the TC39 way back when, had to add this flag in order to support it. Now, in modern environments like ES models, if you're using ESM, then by definition you're using ES6, then they can assume that you're ustrict by default because there are no backward compatibility issues there. Likewise, if you're inside of a JavaScript class, again, it's modern JavaScript by definition, so they can assume ustrict within that class, regardless of whether you put ustrict at the top of the file or not. And the last thing that I needed to add was to skip lib tests, which checks that you have type definitions for all the libs, libraries that you're using, because you were using some old and even almost deprecated libraries, and especially some internal libraries, did not have type information, which means that they did not have a d.ts files, if you're familiar with the concept.
Yes, we would clarify that lib is not liberal versus conservative. That is
Y-
library.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got a library. Let's say you have a library and it was compiled when it was built from TypeScript to JavaScript, and you are only distributing that library because it's an npm package. You're only distributing it as the compiled output, the JS files, but you still want the type information so that code that uses that library can only call library APIs with your passing in the correct parameters of the correct types and stuff like that. So what the TypeScript compiler can do is it generates a file with a .d.ts extension, and that file contains type definitions for that library so that TypeScript knows to verify that you're using that library correctly. But some of our own libraries, especially internal libraries, were old, did not have this support, and unless I told it to skip the library tests, it would fail because it would say, hey, you're trying to use this library. I'm looking for type information for this library and I can't find it. I can't use it. You know, I abort. By setting that skip lib tests, I was able to tell TSC, okay, it is what it is, just deal with it. Give the things that you import from that library type any effectively. Well, not effectively, literally. Um, Now, since all the JavaScript files are also processed, as I explained, as I said, I needed to specify everything to go into a dist folder to avoid collisions. And obviously, you need to add this folder to your git ignore, for example, because you don't want to save that this folder into GitHub, for example, because you don't ever put in Git auto-generated files. The next thing I wanted to do is install types for various libraries that I use. So you basically npm install or yarn add things like at types slash node or at types slash express. Basically, there are a lot of these things that you can install or that are at types slash something based on the service or library that you use, and they just make sure to add the type information for those various libraries and services. So now that if I use a Node API, I get the type checking for that Node API, or likewise for Express, which is really great and what we really want um, TypeScript for. Since I had to put TypeScript itself as a prod dependency, I unfortunately had to put these as a prod dependency as well. In your case, if your CI/CD allows it, you can put both TSC and these type uh, um, packages as dev dependencies. Sorry, assuming again your CI/CD pipeline supports it. I also needed to install a package called source slash map slash support to get the proper debugging support in all the environments that I use with the map files that I've already configured the generation of. A lot of steps, and again, not trivial. For some reason, I couldn't really find, maybe our listeners are better at, they have a stronger Google fu or AI fu than I have and can find this information. I could not find a clear description of all this information. The next step that I had to do is had to do with ESLint. So I assume or hope that you're using ESLint in your project. If you don't, then you should. Um, we had a guest on our show talking about ESLint. ESLint is a linting tool that verifies that you're using the language JavaScript according to best practices, either generally accepted or ones that you've decided on within your organization. It could be almost comical rules like, prefer single quote over double quote so you don't have a random mixture of both types of quote in your project, or it can be about things like putting the curly brackets at the end of the line rather at the beginning of the next line, and so on and so forth. Everything that you prefer in terms of coding style and avoiding bad legal but bad patterns within your code. Now, if you're using TypeScript, you also want to install something called TS ESLint or TypeScript ESLint. We had Josh Goldberg on our show to talk about why you want this. Basically, it's ESLint for your TypeScript. Now, you need it for two reasons. The obvious reason is that it adds particular specific linting rules for TypeScript itself. I mean, because similarly to JavaScript, there can be things that are legal in TypeScript, but you nonetheless prefer to avoid because they are sort of anti patterns in the language. But it actually goes beyond that. It turns out that without TS-ESLint, ESLint itself will flag certain things in your TypeScript code as bugs because they don't match JavaScript linting rules. For example, you can use extends in JavaScript in TypeScript generics, but it assumes that extends is used for extending JavaScript classes and that you're using it wrong and it flags it. So you need TSESLint for the linting to work properly. Now, if you're adding TSESLint, you need to make sure that you're using the latest version of ESLint. Unfortunately, because we were a legacy project, in our case, this was not the case. So I had to update ESLint to the latest version, and then I found out the hard way that the ESLint project did made a significant, not backward compatible change in the way in which they manage configuration. They went to a flat configuration file. They basically changed the whole structure of the configuration. So I had to go through the process of fixing the configurations, and as long as I was there, rethinking the configurations because a lot of the rules were dated. So I updated our ESLint rules as a part of this migration process. As you can see, a lot of work. The next issue that I ran into was the fact that some people in our team prefer using VS Code and some people in our team prefer using WebStorm for JavaScript development. And I wanted to support both. I didn't want to force people to have to switch their development environment, which means that I had to get everything working in both. And where this ran into a problem was with the unit tests. WebStorm out of the box has this great ability that it can actually scan your files, find the unit tests, and make it possible to run individual unit tests and debug individual unit tests directly from within the WebStorm environment. You can actually do the same thing in VS Code, but you actually need to install an appropriate extension first. Once you install the extension, it's great. I actually prefer VS Code with the extension over WebStorm, but that's me. We had developers who preferred using WebStorm. And for the life of me, I could not get WebStorm to handle this situation in which the TS files were located in one place and the output JS files were located in a different place in the disk folder, and to figure out that even though the test code, the source code for the test was here, it should actually run the code that's over there and use the map files to properly support the single step in debugging with the VS Code. And as I said, we were using Mocha and Chai. On VS Code, I was able to install the VS Code extension for Mocha, properly configure it. It just worked in that scenario. WebStorm, I could not get it to work. The only way in which I finally was able to get it to work, as I mentioned before, this TS Node thing, where it's a wrapper to Node that teaches Node how to handle TS files. So I actually had to configure the template file for Mocha on WebStorm to use TS Node instead of Node, and then it worked. So I used a different type of configuration between WebStorm and between VS Code. In VS Code, I preferred the tests to run closer to the way that they run in the CI/CD pipeline. That means to run the test in the compiled test in the dist folder. And as I said, I could get it to work with the source maps because the extension from Mocha was smart enough to handle it. In the case of WebStorm, I don't know if it can or it can't. I could not figure it out. I had to use TS Node.
Now you
So,
can still run the test from the command line. Is that right? It's
yeah,
just what
everything
you're
worked great
talking
from
about is like the UI. It gives you a little button you can press, run this test, debug this test.
exactly, which you want if you want to debug tests. Because when you have that button, you can actually right click it, select debug instead of run, and then you actually single step that test within your IDE. Which, if you have a failing test, the ability to debug that failing test makes life a whole lot easier.
Oh
It's
yeah, that's a
certainly
godsend.
much more
Yep.
fun than console log debugging.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, and the other thing I needed to do was configure the Mocha itself to run all the tests from this tests instead of tests. One more thing. And now I had to start modifying scripts in the package JSON itself. We had all the build scripts and run scripts and dev scripts. So I added a script, for example, a build script, so that you could run TSC as npm run build or yarn build would literally just run TSC. Um, but I also wanted to support a more dynamic mode for development. In development, you want, for example, Node. Node has this ability to watch your folder, see that it changes, and then restart itself um, whenever it identifies that the file is changed. But now it becomes a more complicated scenario because what actually needs to happen is you save that file. You want TSC to notice that the file is changed and then compile it to the disk folder, and then Node, you want it to notice that the contents of the disk folder has changed and to restart itself. So it becomes like a two-step instead of a one-step. Is that clear?
Crystal.
So initially, I did the naive thing. There was a dev script in the package JSON that literally had a node, running node in watch mode. I forget the syntax. Let me take a quick look at how it actually is implemented. Um, So it used NodeMon with a watch to actually automatically reload Node whenever the content of the folder changed. And originally it was running things directly from the source folder. I wanted NodeMon to look at the disk folder instead. That was easy enough, but I also wanted TSC to watch the source folder and see if it changed to compile automatically into the dev folder. And there is a TSC minus minus watch that you can use for that. So one thing you can do is just run those two commands separately. You can open like two terminals, or you can use in VS Code. There's this thing that they called, I forget the name, um, tasks. You can run both two tasks, one to have TSC watching your source and node mon watching your dist. But I didn't want to have to force our developers to do these two steps, where in the past they just did one. In the past they would just do yarn dev, and it just worked, and I wanted to work this way. So initially I was kind of naive, and I did TSC minus minus watch, then ampersand node mon minus minus watch, and it didn't work. Can you guess why it didn't work? It didn't
No.
work because ampersand waits for the process on the left to finish successfully before running the process on the right, if you remember your bash.
Oh, sorry, I'm not a bash guru by any stretch, so
So it
have to
was
explain
waiting
that.
on TSC minus minus watch to successfully finish before running NodeMon, but TSC minus minus watch never finishes. That's the whole point. It runs continuously in order to watch for
Right.
changes in the source
Okay.
file.
That would
So
make sense.
it never actually ran the NodeMon. Uh, so yeah, so the easiest solution that I finally found for this is another package called concurrently, which you can tell it to run both things simultaneously and kill them both if you do a control C. So look at the package called concurrently. That's what I use to fix it. Maybe there's a maybe smarter bash gurus can do it without it. That was the easiest solution for me. That's what I ended up using. Um, Notice one important thing that I have not done so far at all, and that's kind of important. I wanted to emphasize this. All this work was done before I converted even one JS file to TypeScript. So I've got all this pipeline working and TSC working and whatnot, but it's basically compiling JavaScript files to JavaScript files. I don't have a single TS file in the project yet. And that's really important because initially I kind of got ahead of myself and I started moving JS files to TS in order to see that things worked before I had everything properly working. And then I ran into all sorts of problems, which eventually ended up with me throwing the whole thing away and starting from scratch. So make sure you've got everything working so far before moving even a single JS file to TS, because otherwise you'll be sorry. So create a PR from everything that you've done so far. Make sure that everything according to what I explained. Make sure that your your updated CI/CD now passes while running TSC. Again, without converting any TS file yet at all. And I
But
didn't
with the assumption being that when you do convert TS files, then everything's in place, right? You have a everything you've done is to handle the conversion of the TypeScript files to JavaScript.
exactly. I wanted to get to a situation where everything else worked, and then I can start converting files individually and not have to worry about it. I didn't want to deal both with the configurations and the conversions at the same time. So I created a PR. I verified that the whole CI process passed for that PR. I didn't merge that PR. I just wanted to see that it was green.
Yes.
After
Green
I
is good.
saw after I saw that it was green, I moved one and just one file from being a JS file to a TS file and to see that it still worked.
But and by that you just change the extension, right?
No,
Oh.
because that's not enough. If I change the extension, it would complain about various missing type declarations and whatnot. I can obviously set it to super relaxed, not to strict mode, but I intentionally wanted strict mode. So I chose a really small JS file, literally one of the smallest files in the project that I can found, one that was not dependent on any other project file in my project. So it was literally a leaf file. It may depend on external packages, but not on anything inside my own project. And I just converted, but I made sure that that JS file was actually a file that's being used. I didn't want to convert something that nobody actually imports. Um, or requires. And I converted just that JS file to TS. I did it using git mv or git move in order to preserve its history. Are you familiar with git move?
Oh yeah, very much so. It's basically it's one of the weird things about Git. At least to me, it seems a little weird. Maybe it makes sense when you think about it. Is if you want to rename a file, it's not a rename command; it's a move command to move it from one file to another.
Yeah, kind of
You
like
can do the same with a branch. Same thing with a branch.
exactly. So I did a git move of that single file from JS to TS, preserving its history. I added the type information. I I made sure that it's a file that's actually, as I said, again, give the rules. A small file, as small a file as I can find, not dependent on any other file within my own within that particular project, but can be dependent on external things. Is used by one of the unit tests, again, either directly or indirectly, but small and simple, and is required by somebody, again, by a unit test or by some code, um, and and converted that, added the type information, uh, make it as simple as possible, avoid changing execution logic, business logic, just add the type information, committed that change, created a commit for that change, updated the PR, and saw that it still worked. And happily it did.
So
Uh,
you mentioned, you said when I mentioned about just changing the file from JS or even moving it from JS to TS, that it would still fail. So in a TypeScript file, just for clarity, is there something else that we have to put in there that says,
No, you
okay,
need to
this is
put in the
TypeScript?
type information. Unless you make, as I said, as I mentioned, when I created the TS config .json file, I set it to strict type checking. I could have not put it as strict type checking, and then I could have just renamed that file. But I put it as strict, which means that it expects to see type information on things like variables. Unless it can infer the type information, it needs you to give it the type information. So if you do a const x equals 3, it knows that x is a number. But if it's just let x without signing anything, it can't know the type of x. So you need to be explicit about it. Likewise, if you've got arguments, you need to tell it the type of the arguments. It can infer the return value, but you need to give it the types of the function parameters or function arguments.
Okay.
So when I renamed the file from JS to TS, I also needed to put in the relevant type information. After all, that's the whole point of moving from JS to TS, and I wanted to see it handle that type information. And as I said, I moved just that one file. I pushed it in and verified that everything, that all the build works, that the unit tests work, that the end-to-end tests work, that deployment is created, that I can actually use that created deployment, and I even looked in the dist folder to verify that the JS file was created for that TS file and that it contained what I expected it to contain. So I was that anal about it, really, just because again it was that first file. After that, you can be more relaxed in your attitude. I then intentionally introduce a TypeScript error into that file to see that it failed. Because if you don't see that everything fails, how do you know that it's actually even working and not just doing something stupid? So I put in intentionally a TypeScript error. Let's say something's supposed to be a string. I said that it's a number, and saw that TypeScript, failed and the build failed. And then I fixed it again and saw that the build passed again. And as I said, I pushed it into that branch and saw that the CI process passed, sorry, and everything was green. But again, I didn't merge it yet. Instead, I deployed it to our testing environment, and I made sure that I could properly debug it both using VS Code and WebStorm. We've got a rather complicated, for various technical reason, environment for debugging, which involves remote deployments and stuff like that. It's not really important in the context of this discussion. I won't go into the details. I then asked some of my colleagues to test out that branch as well, see that they're also able to use it and debug it and that everything just works for them. Again, I was very, very careful about it. After I got the okay from those colleagues, I rebased the branch, and because we use rebase rather than merge, because it took me a while, so obviously other changes were done in the project during that time. So I rebased and finally merged that PR, and finally we had a version that supported TypeScript and had one and exactly one TS file in that project out of those 1,000 JavaScript files. And I also made sure not to have to do that right before the weekend so that I don't break everything just before the weekend.
Well, that's the general rule anyway, right? You don't do major deployments on Fridays.
After merge, I verified that the main branch again was also built correctly, that all the end-to-end tests passed, that everything worked correctly. I was ready to roll back otherwise. Fortunately, I did not have to. I then basically informed everybody else about this change, and we started discussing about how we can gradually move from JS to TS, and we've been doing it very slowly since then. And that more or less concludes where we are now. And it was, as I said, it was a lot less trivial than I expected it to be. Now, some of the issues had to do with our own unique environment, but still. Now, I have heard other suggestions about how to go about it. For example, um, convert your repo into a monorepo type environment, start pulling out self-contained files as separate packages within that monorepo, and since there are new packages, just make them TS from the get-go. You can do that. You still need to be very careful about how you preserve history and stuff like that. It's not trivial, but that's not what I did in this project. Anyway, I might actually have to do that other way in that project with JavaScript and Flow because I don't think I can get both JavaScript and Flow to work within the same package. Anyway, I'm done.
So, how
um,
many files have you actually, now that all that's in place, how many files have you actually converted?
not so many so far, approximately 10 out of the 1,000. This will take time. The biggest problem in converting files is that Um, well, sometimes you run into complicated types that require generics and stuff like that, and you need to get the team up to speed about TypeScript because a lot of them have been basically just using JavaScript, so they're not as familiar with TypeScript as ideally they should be, and you need to allocate time for that as well. But the bigger issue is that the move to TypeScript has actually uncovered various bugs in the code, places where um, null tests were missing. So, one of the great things about TypeScript is that TypeScript basically uh, having is explicit about something being that can be null. So it's something is can be either if something is is if a variable is of type number, it cannot be null. It you basically if you want it to also be null, you need to be explicit about it and say number or null. Um, and it uncovered a lot of places in the code that um, null tests were not properly put in place, or places where third-party libraries were used and a version was updated that changed the API, but the way in which that library was used wasn't updated, and the wrong parameters were actually passed into certain APIs. Now, somehow it worked, but now TypeScript complains about it and you have to fix it. And you have to think about how do I fix it? It actually requires changing the actual execution code in order to get TypeScript to be happy about it. If you're passing something which is a number into something that should be a string and it happens to work, you know, you don't just want to cast a number a string. You want to fix it. You want it to work properly. So so the biggest time consumer really so far has been basically fixing bugs that TypeScript uncovers.
Yeah, so I do a lot of work with Laravel and PHP in my day to day. And so the past couple of weeks, I've been working with PHP Stan, which is a PHP static analysis tool, hence the name Stan. And Stan, I definitely have a lot of hate relationship with it. Well, a couple of things that I found out is one, uh, cases you're correct. It does the similar thing where you have to declare, okay, it can be either this or null. You have to declare the options. But a lot of times, what I find myself having to do, and I'm curious to see if you've run into this as well, is having to uh, restructure working code for the tool. So in other words, if you have a step that does some chaining and does multiple things, sometimes you have to break that apart so the static analysis tool can realize, okay, this variable is of this class, and then you can go on into it. Where it works fine, with when things are chained together, but you have to break things apart strictly for the static analysis tool. That was probably one of the bigger frustrations that I've, in dealing with that I've had to fight.
Look, you can, yeah, but I'm thinking about how to phrase it. First of all, I'm not familiar with PHP Stand, but I can say that TypeScript is amazing in the amount in the sophistication of the static analysis that it can perform. So, for example, if a variable, as I said, is number or null, and then you do an if in the code and check that it's not null, then it knows that within the scope of that if, the type of that variable is now assumed to be number and not number or null. It's really smart about how to infer the correct type. So the type of a variable actually changes according to the code because of various type checks that can exist in the runtime code. These are known as type guards. We actually talked about them in the recent episode that we did with Liran and Ariel. If you were in that episode, I believe, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we actually talked about that. So TypeScript is amazingly sophisticated about such things. Um, the fact that you need to break the code into smaller pieces, from my perspective, that's actually a benefit. I like my code broken down in smaller pieces. Uh,
Right, and I tend to be that way too. You don't want to, have 15 chain functions on there just for the sake of having shorter code. If a little more broken up code is easier to read, but when it's already working, you got to break it up just for the tool. It can be frustrating.
I agree with that. And that exactly goes to the point that I mentioned that the biggest challenge so far has been those situations in which we actually had to change the JavaScript in order for TypeScript to be happy about it.
Hmm.
And in most cases, the change was for the better.
Hmm.
It was a good change, but it still work. And once you know, ideally, you're thinking, I'm just adding types, so all the tests should pass because the types are removed from the generated code anyway, so they don't impact the tests. But once you have to start modifying the code, you also start breaking tests, which is another reason why you should have
Yes.
good test coverage
Yes.
when starting projects like this.
Right. Sure.
Anyway, I
Okay.
think we're more or less run out of time, no?
Yes, I believe so. Um, Quick question. You had mentioned at the beginning that you had documented this on your internal wiki, and we've got this episode, obviously, but are you going to put this out in written format publicly, like a blog post or something?
I probably should.
Seems like some pretty valuable information.
I think so too. As I said, maybe it exists somewhere, but I just couldn't find it. But it probably is. Probably should. The only problem is that I don't really have a blog anymore.
Oh,
So I need to figure out about where to actually put it. I'm also, as I mentioned, I think I may want to submit it as a conference talk. Not that, it prevents. I can do all three. We now have a podcast. I can have it as a blog and as a proposed conference talk. I just need to figure out where to put that blog post.
Right.
Probably should. You're right.
Alrighty. So with that, we'll move on to picks. Picks are the part of the show where we can talk about anything else, or we can talk about tech if we want. I'll give Dan's throat a break since he's been doing most of the talking here, and do my dad jokes of the week. Maybe we'll get a laugh from Dan, maybe not. So recently, I had to change the password, and I normally use a password manager, but this particular time, we'll say this was back before password managers. I need a password that had 8 characters, so I did Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, right? Because 7 plus 1 is 8. So I've got 3 kids, and when our last one was born, my wife was in labor, and I tried to tell her jokes to distract her from the pain, but she didn't last at all. It must have been the delivery, right?
Oh man.
Oh yeah, this is a recent one. I love it because it's, as somebody pointed out to me on Twitter, it's both funny and inspirational. It says, when you think that all is lost, there's no hope left. Just remember the lobsters in the tank in the Titanic's restaurant.
Oh, that's a good point.
I'm free. I'm free. Anyway, those are the dad jokes of the week. Dan, you got any picks for us?
Yeah, not that many, but a few. So one pick I have is a friend of mine here in Israel called Liad Yosef, great conference speaker, by the way. Um, so he created a very interesting project. He actually put on X the whole story, a thread about the whole story about how they built this thing. It's an incredible read. Unfortunately, it's in Hebrew. Uh, I know that it has a built-in translation capability, but still. But anyway, this really interesting thing is called Git MCP. Uh, I spoke about MCP with Jack Harrington when we had him as a guest on the show. MCP, I forget it stands for, but it's basically a standard protocol for connecting stuff to LLMs. So the LLMs can actually use that protocol to get additional context, additional information, or to control various external resources. So they created something called Git MCP, which basically makes it possible to instantly create an MCP server from any GitHub project. And then you can hand it over to something like Cursor, and immediately Cursor has context based on that GitHub project,
Cool.
which is really interesting. So if you want to learn about some GitHub, you can obviously clone a GitHub project and open it within your within Cursor, and then you get context. But suppose you're working on your own project that uses some other project APIs from some other project, and you want Cursor to be able to help you generate code for using those APIs. Well, with getMCP, you can just point. It's literally just replacing the word GitHub in the URL with github.com with getmcp.io. That's literally it. That URL will immediately work. You just hand over that URL to Cursor, for example, and instantly Cursor has context about that project. It seems like magic to me. I've not tried it myself yet, but it literally seems like magic. Some of the videos that they have on their website literally seem like magic. It's pretty amazing the stuff that you can do these days with these tools.
So
Uh,
MCP stands for, you mentioned the C, it's a model context protocol.
Right. It's a this protocol proposal that's supposed to be a new standard for connecting LLMs to stuff, and
Cool.
it's pretty amazing what they've achieved with it. So it works with Claude, it works with Cursor, it works with Windsurf, it works with VS Code. As I said, I've not tried it yet. I've only learned about it effectively yesterday, and I haven't had the chance to play with it. But it seems pretty amazing. The fact that you can literally just by replacing the word in the URL from GitHub to GitMCP and immediately get it to work is just amazing to me. Uh, and the other pick is I think I mentioned that I'm speaking at a conference in Romania toward the end of May. It's called JS Heroes. I'll be talking about how modern web frameworks use or prefer using RPC as the communication protocol between their front end and their back end. So if you're thinking about frameworks like Next.js or like Quick or like Solid, they're all or TenStack. They're kind of moving over to using RPC. So I'm talking about what RPC is and why they're doing it and what are the implications, the good sides, the bad sides of this transition. And the thing is that, first of all, I have to say that JS Heroes Conference, the agenda looks amazing. The speaker lineup is really awesome. The interesting thing, though, is one of the organizers is Tejas. We've had Tejas on their show a few times. Tejas is an amazing person. And he kind of tweeted recently that a lot of conferences have effectively disappeared in the past year or two, that
Hmm.
there are very few conferences actually still running. Now he should know because he's very involved in the conference scene. He does like 30 conference talks a year or maybe even more. He's really into it. So if he's saying that a lot of conferences are shutting down, I trust him about it, and sounds really unfortunate to me. Uh, my information myself is anecdotal. I'm looking at services like Sessionize, and it does seem to be the case that there are a lot fewer conferences out there. That's really unfortunate, and it seems to me that we should be supporting the conferences that are still running by participating, by buying tickets and attending, by sponsoring. So if you can help a conference organizer keep the conference up and running, please do. My last pick, since I mentioned Tejas, Tejas has his own podcast these days. It's called Contagious Code, which is a nice play on
I
words.
was gonna say, yeah, that's a good name right there.
And he recently posted a new episode, which is really interesting. Usually, most of his episodes are about he interviews people, in a similar vein to the way that we do. Um, and even though we have a podcast, he has a podcast, I have no problem saying that his podcast is awesome. I highly recommend listening to it. In fact, I was a guest on his podcast a while back. But the reason that I'm mentioning it is that his latest episode that he basically put out a week ago is not an interview. Rather, it's Tejas himself speaking for 1.5 hours about the state of AI in 2025. We mentioned MCP. He talks about MCP in detail. He talks about agents. He talks about RAG, and much more. And I'm about halfway in. It's excellent. I highly recommend listening to that episode. I hope we can get him on our show as well. But regardless, I recommend listening to that episode to get really up to speed about the technicalities of AI in 2025. And those would be my picks for today.
Right on. All right. So with that, we will wrap things up. Hopefully, this provided some good information from you that for you that are going to be converting code bases to TypeScript. And Dan, I can people follow you on Twitter if they want to get info, or do you use
Yeah.
Twitter, or where can they find out if you publish this written form somewhere?
Well, if and when I do, I'll obviously announce it on X. Uh, So yeah, they can, and if they're on X, please do follow me. I'm Dan Shapir. That's DANSHAPPIR on X. I'm also on Blue Sky if you prefer that platform instead. So I'm there as well. On Blue Sky, I'm also Dan Shapir. So find me there as well. Follow me here or there or anywhere. I'll gladly follow you back. Also, glad to get feedback about our podcast in general. So feel free to contact me. And that's it.
Alrighty. And if you want to get a dad joke a day, if you're amazed at the quality of my curated dad jokes, you can follow me on X/Twitter at Wonder95. All right. With that, we will wrap this puppy up. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk at you next time.
Bye. And we're stopped.
Okay. Oh, you stopped it?